Ever find yourself wondering, like, why do some people just seem to have this knack for money?
Yeah.
Like it just comes naturally to them. And then others, even if they have a great job, they just like struggle. And that's kind of what we're digging into today with Rich Dad, Poor Dad
Mhm.
by Robert Kiyosaki.
That's a classic.
It is a class. I feel like everyone's at least heard of this book, but we're going beyond just like the surface level today. We're like
Yeah.
really going to extract those key ideas.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about it, I think, is that he uses his own life as the backdrop.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So he grew up with two father figures, his own dad, who calls his poor dad, and then his best friend's dad, his rich dad,
All right.
both successful in their respective fields, but their approach to money was like night and day.
Yeah. And that's important to highlight, right? Like this isn't about one being like a failure and one being like super successful in the traditional sense.
Right.
It's more about their mindset.
Absolutely.
Because his poor dad, educated guy, government job, very much like work hard, get a good education, and like that secure job is the most important thing. Which, I mean,
Sounds familiar,
it's
right?
like that's what we're all kind of raised to think.
Yeah, it's the classic middle class dream.
But then you have rich dad over here who's like, I don't know about that.
Right, and he was really challenging that notion that, the traditional education system always sets you up for success, especially when it comes to money.
Yeah, and he makes this statement, and I feel like this is a good place to pause because it's kind of a controversial one when you just hear it. He says, if you want to learn to work for money, then stay in school. But if you want to learn how to have money work for you, then I will teach you that.
Hmm.
So obviously, nuance here.
Of course.
Like he's not saying don't get an education, drop out of school.
Right. Yeah.
It's more about what type of education are you really getting?
Exactly. And are you getting that financial literacy piece,
Yes.
which is so key?
Which so often is lacking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Understanding how money works, how to make it work for you, how to not just be stuck in that cycle of working for a paycheck.
Absolutely. And a huge part of that, he says, comes down to this really fundamental idea. Assets versus liabilities.
Yes. This is where things start to get really interesting because he kind of turns what we think we know on its head a little bit.
Totally.
So he defines an asset as something that puts money in your pocket. A liability is something that takes money out of your pocket.
Okay.
Simple, right? But how many people actually view their finances through that lens?
Yeah, like if I think about, I'm sure most people, if you ask them what's an asset, they're going to say like their house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the classic example of what most people consider an asset that he would argue is actually a liability.
Okay.
Think about it. Your mortgage payments, property taxes, upkeep, all of that is taking money out of your pocket every single month.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had a rental property that was cash flowing, that would be an asset because it's putting money in your pocket.
Because it's working for you.
Exactly.
So it's not about the thing itself. It's about how it's behaving within your financial ecosystem.
That's a different way of looking at things.
It really is. It's like looking at your finances with a whole new perspective
Yeah.
and realizing that sometimes what you thought was an asset might actually be holding you back.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, he goes on to say that most people are so focused on their income, that paycheck, that they don't focus on building what he calls their asset column.
So, we're starting to see how just shifting your thinking to building that asset column can make a big difference. But how do you actually put that into action? How do we make this real?
Well, that's where he introduces this thing called the cash-age flow quadrant.
Okay.
And it's basically a model that breaks down the different ways that people earn income into 4 distinct categories.
Yeah. All right, break this down for me before we get too far into these quadrants here.
Okay, so picture a big X, right? That's our quadrant. And at the top left, we have the E quadrant. It stands for employee. Pretty self-explanatory. This is where most people find themselves, trading their time for a paycheck from an employer.
Okay, yeah. The system we're most familiar with, for sure.
Exactly, right. And then if you move clockwise around the quadrant, you hit the S quadrant, which is self-employed or small business owner. So think like freelancers, doctors who have their own practice, maybe someone running a local store.
Gotcha.
So they're their own bosses, right? But
Right.
they're still very much trading their time for money, still very reliant on their own efforts.
Okay, more control, but also maybe more risk, potentially.
Exactly, yeah. Now, on the right side of the quadrant is where things start to get interesting, at least according to Kiyosaki.
Okay.
At the bottom right, you have the B quadrant. And this represents business owners who have created systems and teams that generate income, even if they're not directly involved in the day-to-day operations.
Ooh, so they've built something that works for them even while they sleep.
That's the idea.
Nice.
And then finally, at the top right, we have the I quadrant. That stands for investors. And as you might guess, these are people who make their money primarily through investments, whether it's real estate, stocks, businesses, you name it.
So what Kiyosaki is saying is basically like, while you can build wealth from any of the quadrants, those B and I quadrants, those are kind of like the more solid paths towards financial freedom.
That's the gist of it. It's about moving from working for money to having your money work for you.
Right.
But he also stresses that, like, this isn't about getting rich quick. It takes a certain mindset, a willingness to maybe challenge some of the assumptions that you have about money.
For sure.
Yeah.
And one of the big things he talks about that I think is really relatable is fear.
Oh, yeah,
Because, I mean, the world of money finances can feel very intimidating,
absolutely.
especially if you didn't, grow up learning about it. It feels scary.
And he argues that fear is actually what keeps so many people stuck in that, as he calls it, the rat race, stuck in that E and S quadrant, terrified to take risks, terrified to make a wrong move.
Like, what if I mess up? What if I lose everything?
Exactly. So how do you break free from that fear?
Yeah, what's the key?
Education. He's a huge proponent of always expanding your financial knowledge
Makes sense.
because he believes the more you understand about money, about investing, the less fear will have a hold over you.
It's like that classic, knowledge is power.
Right. But he also talks about learning from mistakes.
Yeah, he tells that story about tennis.
Oh, yeah, the tennis analogy. He compares investing to tennis, you know. You're going to miss some shots, you're going to lose some games, but it's about learning from those losses and using them to improve your strategy.
Not letting them completely derail you, right?
Exactly. So it's not about being perfect. It's about having that growth mindset when it comes to your finances.
And that actually reminds me of another thing he talks about a lot, which is finding mentors.
Oh, yeah, that's huge for him
Why is that so important in his view?
because they've been there, right? Mentors can offer invaluable guidance, share their own experiences, help you navigate those potential pitfalls.
They've already made the mistakes, hopefully, so you don't have to.
Exactly. He talks about emulating successful investors, studying their strategies.
Like finding your financial role models.
Exactly. Exactly.
And this is where he gets into some of his more, I would say, specific advice, which can sometimes be a bit controversial.
Right. He's not just talking about basic budgeting here.
No, he's getting into corporations, taxes, legal loopholes.
He wants you to really understand the ins and outs, right? Become savvy about the legalities, the tax implications, all of that.
Because he argues that that's how you build lasting wealth.
And minimize your tax burden, which is a whole other can of worms.
Right. Which some people might hear that and be like, oh, he's promoting tax avoidance. But he would say,
He'd say it's about utilizing the existing rules to your advantage, which, let's be honest, is what wealthy people have always done.
it's about leveling the playing field, right?
Exactly. It's about taking control, making informed decisions, not just kind of leaving it up to chance or outdated advice.
Right. Taking ownership of your finances.
Absolutely. Now, to be fair, his approach, it's not for everybody.
Of course not.
I mean, his books have generated a lot of debate over the years.
Yeah, like what are some of the counterpoints?
Well, some people say that he oversimplifies really complex financial concepts, or that his strategies are too risky for the average person.
Okay, so maybe not for the faint of heart.
Right, and there's even been debate about whether this rich dad figure even existed as he describes in the book.
Interesting. So we've got some of the critiques,
Yeah.
but you can't deny this book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's really resonated with a lot of people. What is it about his message, even with those criticisms, that you think really sticks with people?
It's that idea of taking control, you know. Like, he's not just giving you a budget to follow, he's really challenging you to think differently about money. Like, question everything you thought you knew.
It's like permission to, I don't know, to kind of like buck the system a little bit, not just accepting that whole work until you're 65 narrative.
Yeah. And it's not just thinking differently, it's taking action. Like,
Yeah.
actually doing something with that knowledge.
He's big on that, right? He talks about getting over his own fear of failure by like just going for it, experimenting, even making mistakes. But, and this is key, learning from those mistakes, not letting them hold you back.
He uses that phrase, I love it, think big, don't limit yourself, you know. Really imagine what you want your financial future to look like.
And he does back it up with those real life examples, even if they're a bit unconventional, even risky sometimes. He's not afraid to kind of go against the grain with his investments.
And those exact strategies, they might not work for everyone.
Right.
Right. And honestly, that's another takeaway. It's about finding what works for you.
Yeah, like your own path, your own style.
Exactly. What are your goals, your values, your risk tolerance?
Yeah.
It's got to be tailored to you.
This isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of deal.
Definitely not. And I think if there's one big takeaway from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, it's that financial literacy. It's not a destination, It's like this ongoing journey.
You're always learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Adapting, refining how you approach things. So as we wrap up our deep dive here, what really clicked for you? Was there an idea that sparked something for you, made you want to take action, maybe even challenge something you thought you knew about money?
Because that's what's so great about a book like this. It gets the conversation going, makes you think about things differently, and hopefully gives you the tools to really shape your own financial future.
And at the end of the day, isn't that what it's all about?